What's going on, friends? Harley-Davidson's engine design, and I'm just going to say it, it's probably one of the worst designs out there to try to make any kind of horsepower with. And it may be considered antique, being dang near, well, it is over 100 years old. But in some circles, it's pretty much considered an antique. But what you got to do is you really got to give Harley-Davidson credit for what they've been able to do with this old, outdated design, as a lot of people like to call it. Now, Harley-Davidson has had basically the same engine design for somewhat around 100 years. Now, I know they catch a lot of grief for not updating it, but honestly, why would Harley-Davidson update the engine design? There's a lot more modern designs and a lot better technology out there, but when it comes to Harley-Davidson, maybe their engine design just works extremely well for the intended purpose of the motorcycle. But before we get too far into today's video, please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. In the world of V-twin cruisers, you really have to give something up for something. And undoubtedly, using the single pin crank, Harley-Davidson does give up some horsepower and torque, but the trade-off there is that they get that unmistakable Harley-Davidson to the dump sound. Now, with using a single pin crank, this comes at the cost of horsepower and torque. Let's take Honda Shadow for an example here, the 1100. They came out with the Ace Edition, the American Classic Edition. They went from a double pin crank to a single pin crank. Originally, with the double pin crank, Honda was putting out roughly 62 horsepower and about 69 pound-feet of torque. Honda dumped the double pin crank in favor of a single pin crank, but this came at a cost. It came at the cost of about 10 horsepower and torque. So they were down to about 52 horsepower and 59 foot-pounds of torque. Now, Honda knew they were going to be sacrificing horsepower and torque, but they felt the trade-off was worth it to make the bike sound more like a Harley. Harley felt like Honda was getting in their sandbox, so Harley-Davidson actually sued them. This really happened. Now, of course, the case was thrown out in court because the court basically determined, well, you can't patent a sound. Now, I wouldn't say that it sounded exactly like a Harley, but it was very close to a Harley. And if you ride Harley-Davidsons and you're used to that sound, these bikes will definitely get your attention and make you turn around, and then you realize it's actually a Honda. So, with the single pin crank in mind, it really is a wonder the kind of power that we see out of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle with just nothing more than a cam swap. I mean, I know basically stock, they're not much, but you put a good cam in these things and they will produce some major horsepower and torque. Now, later on in the video, we're going to take a look at the factory monster. And no, it's not the road-going version of the Screamin Eagle 131, although that is an impressive motor as well. Now, Victory really showed us what a modern version of an American V-twin could be, with the single pin crank, the bore valve heads, the direct injection. Victory was really headed in a good direction, especially with their plain bearing cranks. The Victory actually made excellent horsepower right out of the box, and you really didn't have to do a whole lot to them, which is good because there wasn't a very strong aftermarket for Victory, unfortunately. So when Victory came out with all these modern features in their American V-twin, why didn't Harley-Davidson follow suit? Go with a plain bearing crank, do some of the things that Victory was doing that were more modern and up to date as far as design? Well, the short answer is Harley really didn't have to. The overhead cams on the Victory were excellent, but the thing is overhead cams, those really excel at high RPM valve control. Now, I don't really see a lot of people, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I don't see a lot of people taking their electric glide and spinning it up to 9,000 to 10,000 RPM where you would actually really need that. Now, push rods are just absolutely iconic on the Harley-Davidson air-cooled V-twins. And not only that, the push rods are excellent to low to mid-range valve control, and no higher than a Harley-Davidson engine actually revs, you really don't have to worry about losing control of your valves due to the push rods. And not only that, the push rods make the top ends on a Harley-Davidson extremely easy to service. Harley-Davidson engines are just all about simplicity. And with the push rods, you don't have to worry about a complicated timing chain system to run the overhead cams. And you pair that with hydraulic lifters, you really don't have to worry about valve adjustments, even though the Victory did have somewhat of a hydraulic lifter setup on it, so you didn't have to worry about valve adjustments there either. But also, by not using the overhead cams on the Harley doesn't have this big, tall engine. Using push rods, they're able to keep the engine shorter, and not to mention, with the push rod design, changing the cam out on a Harley is really a snap compared to an overhead cam motor. Harley-Davidson is still the only manufacturer that uses a knife and fork single pin crank design with a roller bearing bottom end, and that's probably for good or bad reasons, however you want to look at that. Now, granted, that knife and fork crank, it really does have its pitfalls, but it is excellent for low-end and mid-range torque production. Not to mention, you just can't duplicate that iconic Harley sound with any other style of crank. Now, the other benefit to Harley's knife and fork crank is that they're able to run their cylinders directly in line. They don't have to offset the cylinders like the Victory and the Indian do using the plain bearing crank. Now, no doubt, double pin cranks have more potential for horsepower and torque, and they are definitely the preferred design when it comes to metric manufacturers. Now, having a double pin crank, this allows for a better spread of the dynamic forces across the crankshaft by actually having the connecting rods 180 degrees apart. Now, with the double pin crank, you have a piston firing every 360 degree revolution of that crankshaft. Now, what you lose there is that pop, pop, pause that you hear when a Harley-Davidson idles. So, double pin crank, one of the biggest downsides there is you just don't have that to the dump sound that you have with a Harley, or basically any single pin crank bike. Now, the single pin crank design of a Harley-Davidson, this can't fire every 360 degree revolution of the crank. There's just no way. And this is where we get into an interesting firing order on the Harley-Davidson. Now, on a Harley-Davidson, one piston fires, and then it's 315 degrees before the next piston fires. This basically leaves a 405 degree gap in the revolution, and that's that little pause you're hearing when a Harley idles. And now, granted, the single pin crank is definitely not as strong a design as the double pin crank, and it does really put some extreme forces on the outer connecting rods. If you've ever rebuilt a Harley crank, you know what we're talking about here. But even with the vibration this creates, that vibration is what makes a Harley a Harley. Even when Harley went to the counterbalanced engine, and even on the new Milwaukee 8 with its counterbalancing, they basically had to go back and engineer some of that vibration back in. And that's what a lot of metric manufacturers have found before too. They made them too smooth with the double pin crank, so they even went back and started engineering a little vibration into them to try to make them feel like a Harley-Davidson. Now, Harley-Davidson's knife and fork single pin crank design, this is just about absolutely perfect for excellent low to mid-range torque, decent top-end horsepower, and not only that, that iconic sound that we associate with Harley-Davidson and that all of us love. And if for no other reason to buy a Harley-Davidson, you damn near just buy one for the sound. Now, granted, I would love to see Harley-Davidson go back to the cold forged cranks and the Timken bottom ends. I'm not a big fan of the way they started pressing these cranks together and going to that straight up roller bearing bottom end with a lot of slop in it, not taking the time to set them up properly with the Timken. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Indian Challenger at this point, and you've definitely heard of the Screamin Eagle 131, the big crate motor and the big Stage 4 kit they have for the Milwaukee 8s. Now, if you haven't heard, there is a bagger series of road racing called King of the Baggers, and, well, Harley-Davidson built a factory motor to compete in this series against the Indian Challengers. So basically what they do is they take a stock bagger, well, it's pretty much a frame, but they're allowed to make some suspension modifications and other kind of modifications that basically make a bagger do things it should never absolutely even be imagined that it can do. Now, for Harley-Davidson to take a air-cooled pushrod design and put it up against a modern overhead cam liquid-cooled engine like the Indian Challenger, Harley-Davidson really had to build one monster of an air-cooled motor. And the craziest part about this is that it's still 131 cubic inches. The Screamin Eagle 131R race motor is absolutely insane. This thing produces just over 160 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. Torque is just over 160 foot-pounds at 4,000 RPM. This is unbelievable. And the fact that they even compared this to a stock 114 is insane. Now, those are some very impressive numbers for an engine that is probably the absolute worst design to try to make power with. But high compression, camshafts, good induction, and some worked overheads can really do quite a bit. But keep in mind, this is a naturally aspirated engine. There is no power adder whatsoever on this motor, and it's making these kind of numbers. But anyhow, guys, that's really all I've got for you this week. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But anyhow, guys, tell me in the comments, what do you think? Do you think Harley-Davidson should keep going on with their pushrod air-cooled motors just as long as they can, until they just can't do it anymore? Or do you think they should go ahead and start working into a modern design, which is what we're already seeing happen, starting with the Sportster line? And I see this trend to continue and slowly start to pop up in the middle of the Softails and even in the touring line. And eventually, if we're not all electric, we're probably going to see the water-cooled bikes. But I want your opinion on it. But until next week, guys, stay safe on the streets, dodge those cars, and I'll catch you guys back here with a brand new video. Thanks for watching.